The next stage that we are going to do is the mark stitching, sometimes known as tailor stack or thread marking. Thread marking, the purpose of thread marking is that you're transferring the lines from the reverse, from the wrong side of the cloth, to the right side of the cloth without actually using a chalk mark on the right side. And the objective of doing a thread marking is that sometimes it depends on the cloth and depends on the color chalk that you use. If you mark with the chalk on the right side of the cloth, it sometimes causes the cloth to be stained. And to avoid that, we actually use a thread marking to transfer the information from the wrong side onto the right side. Not only transferring from the wrong side onto the right side, but also transferring from the right side to the left side. So both sides of the cloth gets marked. When you thread marking, you thread your needle on the double. I know you've been practicing your needle and thimble action. It's important that you continue with practicing as you do the stitches. This stitch is going to teach you two things: the mark stitching, but it's also going to teach you to baste, what we call baste on the board, as opposed to be basting on the hand. If we take a piece of cloth, for instance, when we're basting or we're sewing on the hand, we're actually lifting and we're sewing like this. So you've got the base as your finger and you're sewing like this. But what we're going to do this time around is that we are going to sew on the board. So we're going to be doing what looks like a basting stitch, but it's actually going to be cut as a mark stitch. From the very top here, I've got a line across, which is a balanced line. We've got here another balanced line, and we've got a length line here. So we tuck the needle into the point that we're going to start, and approximately 3, maximum 4 centimeters apart, or 1¼ to 1½ inches apart. You tuck the needle in and you lift like this. We're still using the side of the hand to press down against the cloth and sewing from right to left. So you can see the cloth. I'm using my left hand, left fingers, to keep the cloth down in place and to tuck and lift. Flatten that again and pull the thread. Pull the thread, leaving approximately 1 centimeter or ½ inch extended. And we'll do this all the way through. And now, in an effort to be economical, in an effort to be neat as you are actually sewing, you get hold of the needle and use your shears and keep the weight of the shears down onto the cloth, and you cut. Pull, leave approximately 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter, and you cut. Pull again, same amount. And don't leave too much thread, just 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter is more than enough, because if you have too long a piece of thread sticking out, you'd find the thread tends to come out. Also, as we do this stitch, observe all the way through. I'm picking up just about 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters. And the shorter the stitch, the longer the thread would stay into the cloth. Economical, as I said before, because you're using less thread as long as you keep pulling it when you cut. I'm doing my vertical mark stitch first, and then I shall be doing the horizontal mark stitches. In, using your ring finger of your opposite hand to keep the cloth in place. And even though I'm keeping the cloth down with my sewing hand, it's not flat down is just about holding it in place so that I can actually lift the cloth as I'm doing my mark stitch. Now I'd like you to be practicing this mark stitch on a piece of cloth repeatedly. In this instance is the side body of a jacket I'm mark stitching. This is less than a centimeter, less than half inch, but that's perfectly fine. It gives me, it's a much better chance actually of the marks staying in rather than the thread pulling out. So there we are. That is the preparation. That's the mark stitch that you've done. You could see, I'm not going to mark stitch outline yet. Just going to show you the reverse, where you can see just about a quarter of an inch or a bit less coming through. And now that you've got less of the threads coming out, you'll find there's a pretty good chance of throughout the process of making this garment, and even after it's made, you'll find that the mark stitches will stay in. The next stage is just in the mark stitching and transferring the mark stitch. It's a little bit risky, so you must be concentrating and you must be very careful, because what we're going to do now is to cut the threads in between. Cut the threads here so that you'll be transferring the line from one layer onto the other. So we're going to be cutting this, but being very careful as we cut it. It's always best to be cutting the direction that you have actually sewn. For instance, at the very top here, it's a horizontal. At the bottom is horizontal stitch, and you've got the vertical at the side. So let's start with the horizontal first. Lift one layer, press down. Just make sure, we've left a centimeter or so of thread, or half an inch. If you lift up approximately a quarter of an inch like this, then you can be assured that you would not cut the cloth, but you'd be cutting the thread. Also, when you're cutting, be sure to snip the thread only. Don't cut through with the shears, but just cut inside the blade, so like this. So as we cut inside the blade, there's less risk of the point of the shears getting onto the cloth and causing a disaster. So we turn that around and I'll do the other horizontal line, my balance line at the top of the side seam, pulling the threads like this, seeing that you can clearly see that thread, so there's no excuse or there's no risk of cutting the cloth. We're only cutting the thread. Same again. If I turn this to the side and I lift, and many a learner have cut the cloth, and I'd hope you'd not join that list. So here we're cutting the mark stitch only. Now we're turning to the length and cutting through. So just a little pull here, you can see just a little pull, just to loosen that thread, separate the two layers. You can use the point of the shears like I'm using, or you can use your fingers just to pull it apart. You can see how much shorter it's become here now. These are still long, and this has become shorter because I've transferred some of that length onto the inside, and just a little cut. lift and cut. This process is a little bit slower than most of the stitches you'll be doing, but it's best that you are slower and you're safer. So I use the blade just to separate the cloth, pulling with one hand. I'm doing this a lot slower than I otherwise would if I was practicing, if I was actually working, so that you can see clearly where you need to be careful. And this is a very light cloth. This is 7.5, 8 ounce cloth. So it's a lot more vulnerable to making mistakes. And then the last thread at the top of the vent is cutting this one. So I'm not snipping like this because I don't want to run the risk of the point of the shears picking up some of the cloth inadvertently and causing some damage. So there you are, the mark stitches done, the information transferred on to the both layers and onto the right side. Chalk mark remains on the wrong side, and as you saw earlier, where the threads are looped.